In this limud, Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder, we will return to a point that we touched on tangentially in the previous two shiurim, and some of the lomdim specifically asked for a clarification of this point, and that is that the Rishonim use an expression in association with the mitzvah of achila and shtia and shena in the sukkah, and that lashon is a lashon of issa. In the first limud, you'll recall that we saw the lashon of the Rambam, page 42 in the Maramakaimos, where the Rambam in Perek Vav Halacha Vav says, again, page 42 in the Maramakaimos, Oichlin v'shoisim v'yeshenim b'sukkah kol shiva.
Put up the Rambam, please.
Ve'oser le'chol suda chutz la'sukkah kol shiva. The Rambam uses the expression of issa. Lomdim will also recall that in the previous limud, we discussed extensively the shita of the Tur that says that b'layla rishayna, if kshamim yoyred, it's osir lechol kazayis chutz la'sukkah. Again, a lashon issa. And the obvious shaila is that the use of the term issa doesn't seem to be accurate in this case, because the chiyuv of teishvu of yeshivas sukkah, basukkos teishvu shivas yamim, is mechayev the person bekum va'asei to carry out any maisa which would be categorized as a maisa dira. Yes, bekum va'asei, that maisa dira should be carried out in a sukkah. He fails to carry out that maisa dira in the sukkah, he has not been mekayim the mitzvahs asay of being dor in the sukkah. But we can't use a lashon of issa. Although we do find there is sugyas in Shas which discuss a concept of an issa essay, where the Torah is mitzvah something b'lashon essay, but what really we mean is a issa essay. There doesn't seem to be any reason why in the mitzvah of Basukkos Teishu Shivas Yomim we should assume that there's an Isser essay here. There seems to be merely a din, an essay that when a person wants to perform something which is categorized as a Ma'aseh Dira, they should perform that Ma'aseh Dira in the Sukkah. And therefore, more accurately, the Rambam should say, Misha Oichel Chutz LaSukkah Bitel Mitzvahs essay. The lashon oser doesn't seem to be accurate. This shaila of whether we consider achila chutz lasukkah as merely a bittul mitzvahs essay, or somehow there is a way of categorizing performing a ma'aseh dira outside the sukkah as having a din isser, and we'll have to explain where that comes from and what the Hagdara of that issa would be, is l'chara we find that this shaila is discussed clearly by the poskim in four key areas. We'll begin with one noisei in halacha, as Rav Shlomo pointed out in the introduction, which is very relevant halacha l'maaseh, where seemingly the Mogen Avram is expressly discussing if we consider achila chutz lasukkah as having a din of isser or only a bittul mitzvahs esser. The sugya is the din of safinon biyodayim. Machloikes harishonim, if this is an issa deraisa or an issa derabanan, learnt from the pasuk in Vayikra of loisa achilum, where there's an azhara for a godol to be machil lekotten, a dover asa. There's a machloikes what midiraisa is included in this issa and what's only included in midrabanon. Most fundamentally, it's machlokes between the Rashba and the Rambam in Chasmachas Asuris and the Rashba in Masechta Shabbos and Masechta Yevamis. Hanogel in Yonenu is that there is an issa which is called by the poskim the issa of safinon biyodayim, which means a godel cannot give a cotton a dover osa to eat. Now, if we look in the Mogen Avram, in Siman Tov Reish Mem Sifkot and Gimel, in the Maramakoimos pages, that is on page 62. I'm sorry, I apologize. On page 60 in the pages in the Maramakomis of the Shulchan on the booklet, page 60 is the Shulchan Aruch page in beginning of Siman Tov Reish Mem. At the very bottom of the Magen Avraham says that there is a discussion in the Rishonim if a mother has a mitzvah of being mechanech a child, the mitzvahs. Machlokes Rishonim in the end of Masechta Yuma, if a mother has a chiyuv to mechanech a child. The makar of that machlokes, we'll just mention it there, Chagav, is the machlokes is how to understand one of the very first sugyas in the HSukkah, where the Gemara discusses why Hilni Hamalka ate with her children in the sukkah. Was that mishum chayvas chinuch or for a different reason? And so machlokes Rishonim had to understand that Gemara. So the Magen Avraham begins Sifkat and Gimel with a brief summary of the Shittas Rishonim if a mother is mechuyev mitzad chayvas chinuch to be mechanech a child. And that's a technical machlokes, if the aim has a chayvas chinuch or not. But the Magen Avraham says the following, and he says, mashma, there's a mashmos that whether or not the aim is or not mechuyev in chinuch to ensure the child eats in the sukkah, even if we'll say that the mother is potter from being mechanech a child to eat in the sukkah, mashma the acher, someone else, meaning the mother if she's potter from chinuch, or someone who is bechal not mechuyev in chinuch, a fremder, someone else, a stranger, the acher lo yochol lahachilo biyodayim. Someone else cannot give the child biyodayim actively foods to eat chutz lasukkah. Kimoishe kosavti siman reish samachtes. Like I've discussed the Magen Avraham in siman reish samachtes. So the Magen Avraham seems to be saying the way we have the girs in the Magen Avraham that in achila chutz lasukkah there is an iser of safinon, which means someone can't go over to a cotton and give him to eat chutz lasukkah. Kol zman that the child would be able to be oichel basukkah, there wouldn't be an issa to give him a meichel chutz lasukkah. Now, both the Pri Megadim and the Levushe Srod, they change the girsa in the Magen Avraham, and they say instead of the Magen Avraham reading Loi yochol la'achila biyodayim, it should read yochol la'achila biyodayim. If you look on page 61 of the Maramakomis, the facing page to the Magen Avraham, so on the left-hand side of the page is the Eshel Avraham, the left-hand column. In Ois Gimel, Dibar Maschel Chayev, the Magen Avraham, the Pri Megadim says, Umashe kosav da'acher lo yochol la'achila biyodayim, lichoyra roi liois yochol la'achila biyodayim. It should say the opposite. If someone else who's not mechuyev in the chinuch of the child wants to give the child to eat outside the sukkah, so it's not a question of chinuch, but it's a question of safinon. Achila chutz lasukkah safinon zot the Pri Megadim is mutter, not the way it says in the Magen Avraham that there's an isser of safinon chutz lasukkah. Safinon chutz lasukkah, the Magen Avraham should read yochol achila, exactly the opposite. Why? Because he says u'kumeshe kosav Magen Avraham reish siman samechtes yesh liyashiv bozeh. What does it say in the beginning of Siman Reish, in the beginning of Siman Reish Samachtes? So the Pri Megadim says, Diyesh chiluk ben achilas iser u ben heter bizman ha'isser. There's a difference between a meichel, which is itself osser. In other words, the classic case of safinon is giving the child nevelos, or giving the child shrotzim in the way that the Torah has the gzes hakosuv. Here, the actual meichel itself is not osir. What is it? In this zman, there's a din that it has to be nechal toich HaSukkah, but the meichel itself is not a meichel issa. Zog the Pri Megadim, if you look in Siman Reish Samachtes, the Magen Avraham himself says this svara. What's he talking about? The Magen Avraham in Siman Reish Samachtes, if you look on the supplementary Maramakomis, top right, the Magen Avraham there is discussing whether or not when a child is still younger than being mechuyev on Yom Kippur to be mis'aneh sho'is. Cotton. Can one give that cotton to eat on Yom Kippurim? is there an Isser of Safinon Biyodayim? So the Magen Avram says that it's mutter. If you look from the last 4 or 5 lines of the Magen Avram, he says, the second last line, V'yesh chiluk ben achilas iser la'achilas heter bizman ha'isser. K'meshe kosva Teisis b'psochim daf kuf vavam with beis. Teisim Psochim says a klal, that the Rabbeinu Shalom is matzil a tzaddik, that he shouldn't be nichshal in achilas iser. Behemtom shal tzaddikim hakadosh baruch hu eine mevi takol al yodam tzaddikim atzam the kol shekain. So Teisis there says that's only that the tzaddik shouldn't be oichel a dover osir. But for the tzaddik to be oichel a dover heter bizman iser doesn't have that skula, so to speak, of ein hakadosh baruch hu maybe takol al yodam. Therefore, says the Magen Avram, we see from that Teisis that it's more kal where the dover itself is a dover shal iser than where it's a meichel shal heter bizman iser. In the lashon of Rabbi Seinu, the Rosh YESHIVAS, the Magen Avram means a chilik between what we call an iser chefta, than in something where the iser is not an iser chefta, but it's bizman iser. Shimon Shkop, the Mikdash David and others say that an iser that's totally on zman, by definition, is an iser gavra, not an iser chefta. And therefore, where the Isser is an Isser in the Chefza, there's an Isser of Safinon. Because you're giving the cotton a Dover Osser. Masha Inkain, if it's just a Meichel of Heter, Bizman Isser, there's a din of Safinon. That's why one can be Machel the cotton and Yom Kippurim Biyodayim. The Magen Avram uses that same svara to explain a minig which Kimat has disappeared. To those who daven in Yakish shuls, it's still extant, this minig. That as was the minig universally amol, that there was the chazan, the shatz made kiddush Leil Shabbos after Ma'ariv. Now the shatz was going to go home to make his own kiddush, so he wasn't mechaven to be yotzei with the kiddush that he's making. So who drank from the kais? That the bari paragofen shouldn't be a bracha levatol, it shouldn't be a gnai. So they gave it to a cotton. In fact, the Magen Avram, it's really the Beis Yosef's kasha. The cotton is also going home to make kiddush from his father. So you're giving him to drink before kiddush because he's not being yotzei from the kiddush of the shatz. How do you give him biyodayim? Zot the Magen Avram, it's not shver. There's nothing osir about the yayin. It's just yayin before the zman of kiddush. So memela, it's mutter to give it to him biyodayim. So Zot the Pri Megadim, we see that the maskon of the Magen Avram is that there is a basic chilik between a meichel osir and safinon and a meichel shal heter bizman iser. Memele Zot the Pri Megadim. Now let's think about achila chutz LaSukkah. The meichel is not a meichel osir. It's a zman of iser, or a mokum iser. In other words, the yesod hadvarim being, like Rabbi Seinu the Rosh YESHIVAS explained, that achila chutz LaSukkah is not an iser chefetz in the meichel. Even if we'll learn that there's an iser to be oichel chutz LaSukkah, let's say, but what's that iser from? The iser weiter is not an iser in the chefetz. The meichel is not meichel osir. It's not different than having to be oichel, not being oichel b'yom Kippurim, or not being oichel kedem kiddush. So memela Zot the Pri Megadim, we can't keep the girsa in the Magen Avram as it appears before us. The acher loy, says the Magen Avram, yochel achila b'yodayim, because the Magen Avram himself says k'moshe kasafti simirei samachtes. And what's the maskon in simirei samachtes? That a meichel shal heter bizman iser doesn't have an iser of safinon. So memela Zot the Pri Megadim, we have to change the girsa. And the same thing is mavur in the Machzas Hashek in the Levushei Srod, that the Levushei Srod says we also have to change the girsa. The difference is that the Levushei Srod says I have another 2 reasons why there shouldn't be an Issa Safinon by Achila Chutz LaSukkah. And he points to a Magen Avram, again on the supplementary Mar Mekaymis, right hand side, just below the paragraph in the Magen Avram that we just saw. The Magen Avram is speaking about, again, this question of can one give a cotton biyodayim to eat on Yom Kippur? This is a Magen Avram in Siman Tofresh Tezayin Sif Cotton Beis. Again, the same question of safinon to a cotton. So here the Magen Avram says 2 more reasons why it should be mutter, there should be a difference between Zot the Magen Avram giving a cotton to eat on Yom Kippur and achila chutz LaSukkah. And here we're directly now discussing achila chutz LaSukkah. Zot the Magen Avram. He says, the Magen Avram says that even if we'll say that there is an Isser of Safinon on Yom Kippur, meaning we don't accept this chiluk between Meichel Shel Isser and Meichel Shel Heter Bizman Isser, and we say that there is an Isser of Safinon on Yom Kippur, nonetheless, says the Magen Avraham, V'lo domi l'sukkah. It's not the same as a sukkah. Sherashoim litein lechol chutz la'sukkah. Zot the Levushay Srod, I have an even better hechrich, so to speak, than the Pri Megadim, that there's no Isser of Safinon chutz la'sukkah. The Magen Avraham in Siman Reish Samech Tes is discussing giving before Kiddush and Yom Kippurim. And there the Magen Avraham seems to say that Meichel Shel Heter Bizman Isser is not a problem Safinon. Zot the Levushay Srod, I have a mefurish Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham says that even if you'll be machmir and say that you can't be Safinon on Yom Kippurim, and we don't accept that Meichel Shel Heter Bizman Isser is more kal b'negeh to Safinon, I have other reasons why you can still give him chutz la'sukkah. One says the Magen Avraham, and we'll go to the second tam first, because Zok the Magen Avraham at the very last line, the Hossam having mitzvahs essay. It's only a mitzvah saseh. Says the Magen Avraham, a mitzvah saseh, Bechal doesn't have the din of safinon. Meaning, even if we'll learn that achila chutz la'sukkah is an issa mamish, but the Torah doesn't say it as a lav, it's soif kol soif, the issa would be mikoach mitzvah. Mimela zot the Magen Avraham, a different chiluk. There's no issa of safinon where the issa is only a mitzvah. The issa of safinon is only where the issa is a lav. So in other words, until now we've been discussing a kula in safinon because it's only zman issa, not meichel issa. Now the Magen Avraham has another svara. Oh, so it's another svara. We'll get to that in a moment. Zot the Magen Avraham, it's only a mitzvah essay. Zot the Magen Avraham, if you look back in Siman Reish Samech Tes, we won't focus on it because it's not directly HSukkah, but just to answer the question. When the Magen Avraham first begins his discussion of can you give a cotton to drink Kedem Kiddush, he brings up Beis Yosef, that Beis Yosef says the reason why it's mutter is because, again, Kiddush is only a mitzvah essay. So we can give it to him. The Magen Avraham is mefalpel, and he says, I have another svara of Zman Isser and not Meichel Shel Isser. So Zot the Levushay Srod, I now have another reason why Safinon Chutz HaSukkah should be allowed, because it's only an essay. So we have one is the reason of the Pri Megadim, that it's Meichel Heter Bizman Isser. Two, we have the svara of the Levushay Srod that the Magen Avraham himself says, based on a Beis Yosef, by Kiddush, that it's only a mitzvah essay. What we'll focus now is on the third svara, which is the first svara of the Magen Avraham here, where the Magen Avraham says the following, Loshen, which is a little sosum, and we'll see in Machlokes Achronim how to understand it. He first says, first of the wide lines, in Tofresh Tazayin, he says, V'lo domi l'sukkah sherashoim liten lelechel chutz l'sukkah, the Hossam be'achila ein iser. In the achila itself, chutz l'sukkah, there's no iser. V'hi noisenes loi, she just gives it to him. Uma lo im yoichal b'sukkah oy chutz min assukkah ve'einu mechuyeves lachnisa l'sukkah. What's the Magen Avraham saying?
What's this longer riches? Why
What's
not
that?
say there's an issue finished?
So the Magen Avraham seems to say, firstly, there's no iser. It's only that we are mechuyev to mechanechim to go eat toich HaSukkah. The Isha is potter from chinuch, like we said. So Mimela, what's out the Magen Avraham? What's the problem? She's giving him to be oichel. The achila chutz l'sukkah is not aser. The only din is to be mechanechim to go into the sukkah, and she's potter from chinuch. Seemingly the straightforward reading of the Magen Avraham is exactly this svara, that the Magen Avraham is saying that the whole sugya of safinon is not relevant here. The whole sugya of safinon is only where there is an isser in what's being done. So not quite. What's the difference? The difference is Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is for sure an isser to be oichel. It's a lav. But still the Magen Avraham will be matir because it's not an isser chefta. This isn't saying that. This svara we wouldn't be able to use for Yom Kippur, correct? Because the Magen Avraham is clearly saying there's no isser in the achila.
There is an issue.
Let's make it clear. We have three svaras. One is it's a mitzvah sesser. That for sure doesn't apply to Yom Kippur. We have a second svara that it's achilas isser bizman heter, that applies to Yom Kippur. Now the Magen Avraham is saying even without achilas heter bizman isser, or without it being a mitzvah essay. I have another svara. There's no isser here b'chlal. In the case of the Yom Kippur, it is an isser, but it's what the HaRav call it's an isser gavra. It's not in the meichel, not in the chefta. Here the Magen Avraham says even more than that. There's no isser b'chlal. The din is go tell the cotton you have a meichel, go eat in the sukkah. If she's potter from chinuch, she's not mechuyev to tell him go into the sukkah. Elamai, he's going to eat chutz sukkah. What is?
She's allowed to put it in his mouth.
Is there? So we'll get to that in a moment. Be'ez Hashem, we'll see that nidin is mefurish in Achrein. So Zot the Magen Avraham, what's the problem here of Safinon? Calls man that you don't have to be mechanech. He'll be oichel chutz sukkah. Is was? There's no aresa b'chlal. Elamai to tell him to go inside. She's potter from chinuch. So there's no sugya Zot the Magen Avraham of Safinon b'chlal. So the straightforward reading of this Magen Avraham in Siman Tov Reish Tezayin, which is Nichas Yom Kippurim, that the Magen Avraham is mechalik between possibly having an isser of Safina and Yom Kippur, but a heter of Safina and Chutz LaSukkah. Zot the Magen Avraham, we have the chiluk of either it's a mitzvah essay, or we have the Pri Megadim from Reish Samech Tes, that it's Zman isser, and Achilas heter, or we have the svara that there's no isser b'chlal. So l'chor zochinu that the Magen Avraham himself is touching on this shaila and saying lehedya that there's no concept of isser of achila chutz sukkah. All it is an essay of kum echol basukkah. So there's no isser of safinon in that case. That's what seems to be mavur, the simple reading of the Pri Megadim. Mela zot levushay srod. Again, we have to change the gears in the Pri Megadim. How could the Pri Megadim say that there's an isser of safinon chutz sukkah? HaRav the Magen Avraham himself says in Tov Reish Tezayin mefurish there's no isser of safina. One, because it's either an isser essay, or it's not an isser b'chlal. It's just kum asay of echol b'sukkah. So on that, there's no isser of safina b'chlal. There's only a chayvas chinuch, go eat in the sukkah. And in that, she's potter. I'm sorry?
Lo yochel, it's not grammatical anyway. Lo yochel, the woman who is
what of litin lo lechel chutz sukkah?
No, where the question is whether it makes the hagar.
Oh, I see. You say when we come up and mashma the acher yochol lahachil biyodayim. The way we have in the Magen Avraham is acher lo yochol lahachil biyodayim. It should be talking about the mother. Should be
no, he's saying the grammar is not modern grammar.
Laha achiloi. No, it does. The lashon of the Magen Avraham is the acher lo yochol laha achiloi biyodayim. If anyone could share this, the lashon.
All is yochol or lo yochol. That's all.
It's just a question of taking out the loy. The lashon of the Magen Avraham, the way we have it, is acher lo yochol achila biyodayim, and we take out the loy, so acher yochol achila biyodayim. No, correct. It's either an isha or a fremda. That's what we said. Or someone who's not mechuyev in chinuch. Someone else. Bezdin, yeah, someone else. Someone who's not mechuyev in chinuch hakaponim. In the case of the Magen Avraham, Tov Reish Tezayin, we're speaking about the mother. In the case of the Magen Avraham here, we're speaking about anyone who's not mechuyev in chinuch. Yeah, so that's all if we change the gears in the Magen Avraham. We take out the word loy. The Machzah Shekel says, in the Magen Avraham says the word loy. The word loy, it's going to say, it says loy. Zot the Machzah Shekel, we misunderstood what the Magen Avraham is saying in Tov Reish Tezayin. The Magen Avraham never meant to say a blanket klal, that whenever it's just an essay of kum echol basukkah, there's no problem with safina. Didn't mean that. Let's see the lashon of the Machzah Shekel. It's on page 63 of the Maramakaimos, bottom of the page, right-hand column. He says, third line, towards the end of the third line, even if the cotton would eat chutz sukkah, loy ichpaslan. Right? We don't care. Why? He gave him a dover heter. Why? Not because the Michael isn't osir, and not because it's only an essay. Let's read carefully the Machzah Shekel, and I think we'll see a dover nifla. He says, the cotton might decide to go inside the sukkah with his food. The fact that the cotton decided to eat it chutz sukkah, Koton adaite de nafshe ovid. The cotton did that on his own volition. Kain kosav mogen avrom le'el simen tofresh yudvav.
It doesn't say it.
The Gemara with the keys.
So correct. So Zokta the Machzah Shekel, we misread the Mogen Avram. We read the Mogen Avram Sharashayim Litane the Hossam Ba'achila in Iser Umalo Milcha Basukah means that you didn't give him any dover also. It's only a din of kumasei of echol basukah, and she's not mechuyev in chinuch. Zok the Machzah Shekel, what the Mogen Avram means? The Mogen Avram never said there's no din safinon where there's an asay of kum echol. It means if I gave it to him, what did I do? I didn't do a safinon. Why? Because even if I would give it to him, that's not the dover aser. Now the cotton is going to decide, am I going to the sukkah, am I going to not go into the sukkah? That's his decision, nothing to do with my safinon. Okay, so if I gave him a meichel on Yom Kippur, with a meichel on Yom Kippur, there's no eitzah. You eat the meichel on Yom Kippur, it's achila b'yom kippurim. I gave him the kois shel kiddush, I'm telling him to drink it. He's going to drink it, koidim kiddush. But here in the sukkah, I gave him a meichel, mimela. That's not safinon. Let him go into the sukkah now. What did I do? So Zot the Machzah Shekel, the Mogen Avram never said what we think he's saying. The Levush Srod said, how could the Mogen Avram say there's an Issa Safinon? Is there a Mogen Avram in Tofresh design that says there's no Safinon by an essay? Nishtas a Mogen Avram. Pshita, that's not Safinon.
The president sees the sukkah is locked, and you're not allowed to give it to him.
Oh, wait, let's see. Correct. Why? Go. Did I tell you anything about eating it? I gave it to you.
No,
I'm mechuyev to only give the cotton Michael Teichasukkah. I'm mechuyev to only give him Teichasukkah. What is? But Rabbi Yisai, let's see now. You're 100% right. So again, we're being maktim. We're talking about someone who's not mechuyev in his chinuch, an acher or the mother. So I'm not about avada. The father nishdokin shum shayla. As soon as the child is holding a bilkala, he has to tell him dav's gain in sukkah right. That's his chinuch. Avada nishdokin shum shayla in them. We'll be maktim again and be madgish. We're speaking about in a makam that there is no chayvas chinuch. It's only a shayla of safinon. I appreciate it again to emphasize and make that clear. Zod Machzah Shekel, we misunderstood the Mogen Avram. There's no klal that where it's only kumasei echol basukah. There's no din safinon. There's no such Mogen Avram. The nafkimina Zod Machzah Shekel is like this. Lu Yitzuyu, you would tell the cotton, go eat in the sukkah. Or Lu Yitzuyu, the cotton would be chutz la sukkah, and you would put it in his mouth. You would make him eat it. You would feed him. Mamash biyodayim. So Zot the Machzah Shekel, Avad in that case is an Isser of Safinon. Avad is an Isser of Safinon. Why? Because the Mogen Avram in Tofresh design is only saying that the reason why there's no Safinon is because what has you giving him a Meichel to do with whether or not he decides to eat in the sukkah? That's a daita the nafshe. So Rabbi Yisrael Lechara, there's a broad nafkimina now. According to the Tam of the Pri Megadim, that it's Meichel Hete Bizman Isser, or according to the Tam of the Beis Yosef that it's only an Isser essay, there's no Isser Safinon B'chlal. If you would tell him, go eat it in the sukkah or put it in his mouth, nothing wrong. I mean, it's probably not right to do it for other reasons of Dumas in the Misrach or whatever it is. But mitzad the Isser of Safinon, nothing wrong. Zok the Machzah Shekel, but lefi this time of the Mogen Avram, the way we're explaining it, that it means that you aren't doing the safinon biyodayim, you're only giving it to him, and the subsequent achila teichasukkah is not related to you giving him meichel, it's a daita the nafshe. If you would actually make him eat teichasukkah, avada you'd be over on safinon. Chutzasukkah, I'm sorry. Avada you'd be over on safinon. So it's a broad nafkimina now. Is there an isser of safinon of chutzasukkah? Let's see the Mishnah Berurah halacha lemaisa. Zot the Mishnah Berurah in the Maramakomis pages. That's page 90 in the Mishnah Berurah. Simon Tofresh Mem says Negeh halacha lemaisa. It's a very broad shaila. Yeah, which
how do you feed a kid on sukkah?
Yeah. Zok the Mishnah Berurah. Sivkot Hey. Ulekuli alma. 2 lines down in Sivkot Hey. Right hand side. Right hand column in the Mishnah Berurah. Ulekuli alma. Oser lehach lekotten biyodayim chutz lasukah afilu laodam acher. Even another person, the fremder. Dahainu, says the Mishnah Berurah, litein l'toich piv or l'tzabes le'lechol. Where's the makar for that? Zok the Sharatzion. Ulafuke k'shemaniach lefonov le'echol. If you just put it in front of him, v'hu oichal me'atzmoi. That's, where's the makar for that? Machzah shekel. Dahainu, if you look in Sivkot and Zayin, ayin mogen avrom upri megodim umachzah shekel, meaning that according to the Pri Megodim and the Levushe Srod, the Mogen Avram said, Adarabah, you can be Safinon. It's only according to the Machzah Shekel that you can't be Safinon. And the Machzah Shekel is only talking about a case where you actually give it to him directly in his mouth, or you tell him, go eat it right here in the kitchen. So the Ma'aseh of the Mishnah Berurah is Machmir. Like the Machzah Shekel, and the reason why is because the Machzah Shekel, we don't need to change the gears in the Mogen Avram. And then we can keep it, just we have to be sovel somewhat. This doichak, that when the Mogen Avram says that acher lo yochol le'achilo biyodayim, it means la'achilo, means literally la'achilo.
Stick in his mouth.
Stick it in his mouth. So homias, what we have now is whereas we thought before we saw the Machzah Shekel, and Pashas that's how Levush Yisrod understood, that the Mogen Avram in Hilchos Yom Kippurim says that the reason why there's no safina is because the geder of achila chutz HaSukkah is only an essay. According to the way the Machzah Shekel understood, that's not what the Mogen Avram is saying at all. The Mogen Avram has never said that it's not an issa to be oichel chutz l'sukkah. Fakert, the Mogen Avram Be'etzim is saying there may yes be an issa to be oichel chutz l'sukkah. Why is there no safinon? Because there's no connection between you giving the kot and the meichel and him deciding if he is or isn't going to eat it to HaSukkah. That's adaita the nafshi. Is that what? Put it in front of him? Yeah. Yes, you could. Yes, you could. That's adaita the nafshi, is not the Machzah Shekel. It's adaita the nafshi. It's adaita the nafshi. The child could in yotze yochel, any yochel. If I'm you're right. I think you before one of the London compared it to the Gemara in Shabbos of Kotin adaita the nafshi obed with the maftechas. You're right. If the child understands that the Gadol wants him to go in the sukkah and doesn't want him to eat in the kitchen, very possibly it's not adaita the nafshi. We have to be mefalpul to compare it to the sugi in Shabbos. I'm sorry. Correct. Exactly. So that's the midden of adaita the nafshi. Right. Correct. The Mogen Avram is mamshech there in Seminary Samach Tes and has other svaras to be matter. Correct. We just took out the part of the Mogen Avram that's relevant to Safinon. Correct. There's kama v'kama timing that the Mogen Avram discusses. Absolutely, yeah. So
Is the Misharesis Akum subjected to this? Can she feed the kid?
Does she have an issur of Safinon?
She has no issur anything.
No,
She's a mutter.
Correct. Which we find in Hilchos Yom Kippurim. Similar nid. Yeah. So perhaps we'll have an occasion to discuss more barichas this thing of Safinon, very negei lahalacha, about giving a small child to eat chutz HaSukkah. B'mtzeinu l'meidim that in the initial maramakim that we thought to bring from the pashas of the Mashal of the Mogen Avram in Hilchos Yom Kippurim, that's mashma that there's no concept of issa b'chlal associated with achila chutz HaSukkah. It's only an essay. It's totally in a machlekes achreina between the Levush Yisrael and the Machzah Shekel. And the Mishnah Berurah paskins, as we saw, like the Machzah Shekel. The second place where we see that, and this is not in Rishonim, but this is in Achreinim, where the Achreinim are done in this shaila of whether or not achila chutz l'sukkah has a teras issa, is in the din of shluchei mitzvah p'turim in HaSukkah. So again, on the supplementary Maramakomis right-hand side, just below the Mogen Avram that we saw, is a paragraph of Pnei Yeshua. Towards the end of the Pnei Yeshua begins with a kasha. Pnei Yeshua asks that shluchei mitzvah, that they're potem in a mitzvahs, oisik ba mitzvah potem in a mitzvah, is nothing unique to that in Hilchos Sukkah. A chosin is potem in a krishma, koiveres mesa is potem in a mitzvahs. There's kama v'kama sugis b'shas, which discuss oisik b'mitzvah potem and mitzvah. So the basic din of the Mishnah of shluchei mitzvah p'turim and HaSukkah, laila is another din. But shluchei mitzvah p'turim and HaSukkah, the etzem din, which the Gemara brings psukim for, of b'shach b'cha v'kumecha, is not unique to mitzvah sukkah. So frek the Pnei Yeshua, why does the Mishnah choose to illustrate the case of shluchei mitzvah p'turim and HaSukkah, dafka by sukkah? It's by Krishma, it's by Kaiveres Mesai. As I frek the Pnei Yeshua. So one of the tirutzim that the Pnei Yeshua gives, and he says, towards the bottom of the paragraph, he says, Sukkah is not similar to other mitzvahs like Krishma and so on. When a person is oisik ba mitzvah and he's not kaira Krishma, chosen potem and Krishma, he merely isn't performing the maaseh of Krishma. Masha in King Zot the Pnei Yeshua besukkah ikenami isura bekum essay kisha oichel v'shoise v'yoshin chutz lasukkah. Meradik. Zot the Pnei Yeshua, there's a chiddush over here because there's an isser bekum essay kisha oichel v'shoise v'yoshin chutz lasukkah. He's not being mevatel the mitzvah b'shaval taseh. He's being over an isser bekum essay because he's actually being oichel positively chutz lasukkah. He's only b'shaval taseh, not being oichel teich HaSukkah. The part that the Torah was mitzaveh him to do, he's not doing b'shaval taseh. The Torah says if you want to be oichel b'shoisa and do a ma'aseh dira, go and perform it in the sukkah. So b'shaval taseh, he's doing it outside. So the Pnei Yeshua, no. Bekum essay, he's being oichel chutz HaSukkah. And that the Pnei Yeshua calls isura bekum essay. Lashon HaPnei Yeshua. Ikanami isura bekum essay. Kisha oichel b'shoisa v'yoshin chutz HaSukkah. So that's what the Pnei Yeshua. When the Torah is mitzaveh to be oichel chutz HaSukkah, michlal that is a ma'aseh dira performed outside the sukkah is a ma'aseh is a ma'aseh issa. Me'ein and isser essa. Seems to me it's a simple reading of the Pnei Yeshua. The ma'aseh of achila chutz LaSukkah is an achila be'isser because it's an achila be'oifen bittul essa. That's a lashon of the Pnei Yeshua. A ma'aseh that's done in lehedya, in contravention of an essay, is mugdar by the Pnei Yeshua as a ma'aseh issa. Not saying Krishma is b'sheval taseh. A ma'aseh that's done bekum ve'essay, and in bekum ve'essay is a bittul essay. It's not the Pnei Yeshua that has the status of issa. And we don't find oisik b'mitzvah can be over an issa. We find oisik b'mitzvah is potter min ha-mitzvah, but can't do a ma'aseh, which is a bittul mitzvah essay b'ma'aseh, which is categorized as issa. Zoi zot the Pnei Yeshua. Mela, that's the ma'aseh of your potter. So the Pnei Yeshua doesn't say, correct, so the Pnei Yeshua doesn't say the kamash malon. Why taka is it like that? But that's what the Pnei Yeshua says. Mela, that's the chiddush. Ad kan teichen divrei Pnei Yeshua. Now the Pnei Yeshua at the end seems to say, possibly, it depends on the exact reading in the Pnei Yeshua, the enochanami, the p'tur is teshuv kein tadur. We need teshuv kein tadur for that also. Not clear that that's what the Pnei Yeshua means. But let's assume that's not the pashtus in the Pnei Yeshua, and we'll leave this as an open shayla. So my komashmalon, so why taka? Is there a p'tur of oisik b'mitzvah, patam and a mitzvah? What's the answer to the Pnei Yeshua? So in Rabbi Kiva Eger we find, it's brought in Chedush Rabbi Kiva Eger on Daf Chaf on the mission of Shluchei Mitzvah, that the shoyel asked Rabbi Kiva Eger this very shayla. And he said, how could it be that Shluchei Mitzvah patam and sukkah is oisik b'mitzvah? Ha-hasom, the shoyel says, hevi b'sheval taseh, ma she'en kim b'sukkah, da'achila b'sheina chutz ha'sukkah, oiver be'esei biyodayim. The lashon of the shoyel is very meduktuk. Oiver be'esei biyodayim. He didn't say osa. He said, how can you compare allowing someone just not to be mekayim a mitzvah's essay to do a ma'aseh bekum ve'essay that he's mechuyev to do different? So the shoyel has a hanocha and svara that we only find oisei b'mitzvah patam and a mitzvah to allow one to be b'sheval taseh, not mekayim a mitzvah, but to actively do a ma'aseh bekum essay which contravenes the tzivui, that we don't find. Zot Rabbi Kiva Eger b'mechilas kol tirosai shogag b'zeh. He made a basic mistake. Why? De'eina la'achila iser klal shelo lechol chutz lasukkah.
He's talking about Pnei Yeshua?
He's talking to a shayel.
He's talking to a shayel. This is not addressed to the Pnei Yeshua.
Yeah.
I don't think the Pnei Yeshua wouldn't write Mechilas Kloiter also Shogag was onto the Pnei Yeshua. It says the Ein Al Achila Iser Klal Shalei Lechol Chutz HaSukkah Elo the Mutal Olav Lekayim Mitzvahs Essay Sheyeh Achilosei Chutz LaSukkah. The mitzvah is go eat basukah. Therefore, Zot Rabbi Kiva Eger v'me'eno helech LaSukkah lechol And if he doesn't go to the sukkah, achilose shom nevatel mitzvahs esay. He merely hasn't been mekayim mitzvahs esay. And therefore, says the Pnei Yeshua, it says the Kiveger v'imkein haberak sheval taseh she'ena oichel basukkah.
How
Now,
does he answer the kasha from Isaac mitzvah?
so let's be master Rabbi Kiveger. So in Mele Zot Rabbi Kiveger like this. He says loy meboya that it doesn't have a din of iser chutz sukkah, but it isn't even considered being mevatel a mitzvah bekum ve'esay. Rabbi Kiveger sees it that b'sheval taseh I'm not going into the sukkah. Again, let's be medayik in the lashon of Rabbi Kiveger. Elo demutul olav lekayem mitzvahs esay sheyiyeh achilose b'sukkah. What's the hagdar of the mitzvah? That if you are going to perform an achila, that achila should take place in the sukkah. And if it doesn't, then we don't say bekum ve'esay, you're eating outside the sukkah. That's not the way we look. That's not the way we characterize it. It's merely that b'sheval taseh you haven't performed that achila toicha sukkah, but it doesn't even have the status of a bittul essay bekum ve'esay. It's just not true. There's no kum ve'esay of achila chutz sukkah. The Rabbi Kiveger's lashon is extremely accurate. He says the ein ala achila is a cloud. There is nothing. The achila is not subject to any dinim. Elo de mutal olav, it's mutal on the person. Lekayim mitzvahs esay sheyeh achilose basukkah. V'meine hoylech lasukkah achilose sham mevatel mitzvahs esay. V'im kein haberak sheval taseh. That's the dogma. That's a mashal that Rabbi Kiveger brings, which Be'ez Hashem will come back to. So divrei Rabbi Kiveger boro milelu, that loy meboya that we can't characterize it as iser, but we can't even characterize it as bittul mitzvahs esay bekum be'esay.
Where does the Yeshua take it? How does the Yeshua take it?
So we have now, let's summarize. So we have now a very fundamental machlokes between the Pnei Yeshua and Rabbi Kiveger. Leave aside even Issa for a moment. Even how we understand achila chutz sukkah. Rabbi Kiveger is saying afazoi vayit that we don't even look at it that you're doing a maisa or being mevatel and eseh bekum ve'eseh. All the mitzvah is that achila should take place somewhere else, and if it doesn't, you merely lost the opportunity, and we're not mekayim the essay that achila should be here, not there. B'sheval ta'aseh. Zot Pnei Yeshua oidu limios, and that's the swara of the shoyel. That if you're actively being oichel chutz sukkah and you're actively performing the mitzvah outside the sukkah, bekum ve'eseh, you're being mevatel the essay, Kiveger won't concede that, not even that. Now the Pnei Yeshua goes a step further and he even gives it a shem of an issa. Says it's an issa and therefore shouldn't have the din of oisik b'mitzvah bottom in a mitzvah. What does issa mean? That means the Pnei Yeshua is saying that to actively be mevatel and essay biyodayim is awesome. Not also like a lav of nevela, but to do a maisa which is actively an akiras essay is called awesome. And therefore shouldn't have the din of oisik b'mitzvah bottom in a mitzvah. Dahainu. The shoyel said the reason why there shouldn't be oisik b'mitzvah bottom mitzvah is because b'mitzias it's different from kriyashma. Krishma is just not doing, and here, bekum ve'esay, you're doing chutz sukkah. That's a svara. The Pnei Yeshua is saying much more. The Pnei Yeshua is saying because you're being mevatel biyodayim, you're actually not allowed to do a ma'aseh. There's an isser to perform a ma'aseh that's in contravention to an essay. A ma'aseh biyodayim that's oiker an essay is osir. Zot the Pnei Yeshua. Of course, then we don't have the din of oisik b'mitzvah because oisik b'mitzvah is potter, but not that therefore you can be over an isser. So l'sikum advarim, we have 3 steps in this nidin. Mamish nifla. Rabbi Seinu Achreinim, what Rabbi Seinu Achreinim are clarifying for us. We have Rabbi Kiveger who says on the one extreme that it's not even considered bittul eseh biyodayim. It's merely b'sheval taseh that achila b'sheval taseh is not taking place in the sukkah. The shoyel says it's being mevatel mitzvahs essay bekum ve'essay. You're actively being oichel chutz sukkah. And the Pnei Yeshua goes a step further and he says because of that it has a status of issa. And therefore certainly oisik b'mitzvah bottom mitzvah doesn't apply. Yes, we'll get to that, Beis Hashem. Yeah, we'll get to that. That's a shadow of Oinin, and we'll get to that, Beis Hashem. Let's take it step by step. So, Reb Shlomo, what would you suggest that we?
We'll go a little over.
What would you suggest that we should prioritize? How we for time, Reb Shlomo?
You turn to which issues?
Yeah, which any
The following
suggestions?
issues?
Yeah, okay. We'll
go so quickly.
we'll be done.
Einan
Okay.
and-
How are we for time, Reb Shlomo? We're okay for
We'll
time.
have time.
Geweldig. So, Betzem, it's kedai to point out that Rabbi Kiva Eger seems to be soisa mishnasai mikatze ala katze. Rabbi Kiva Eger, in another tshuva, discusses a fascinating shaila. The shaila is a shaila of the Pri Megadim. On the last day of Sukkot, Yeshana Rabbah going into Shmini Atzeres. The Ran discusses whether or not, if a person realized that he didn't shake lulav on Hoshana Rabbah, and it's now Bein Hashmoshes into Shmini Atzeres, is he mechuyev to akaponim at least misofik to be noita lulav to chaparai mitzvos lulav akaponim misofik Bein Hashmoshes sofik yom sofik laila? If it's Shmini Atzeres and Avada, we're not noita lulav. If it's still Hoshana Rabbah the day before, then he should be. What does he do? The nafkamina is whether or not it becomes muktzah Bein Hashmoshes and therefore muktzah for the whole of the next day. So the Ran says that Bein Hashmoshes, top right of the supplementary Maramakomis, Einoi Noitel Halulu Davi Sofik Derabonon. Sofik Derabonon, and therefore you're not mechuyev Bein Hashmoshes to be Noitel Lulav because Sofik Derabonon the Kula. It's a very, just touch on this Derech Hagav, very broad noisei in the Achreinim. If I have an option, I could put him lechatchila to try to be Yitzed Rabbanon. Why should we say Sofik Rabbanon l'hakol lechatchila? This shaila is asked by the Sfasemes, and it's a broad nidin in the Achreinim. But as I state in Ram, Frek the Pri Megadim, I have a mefurish Ram that says fakeret. Shmini Atzeres going into Simchas Torah. A person wants to eat something, going into Bein Hashmoshes, Shmini Atzeres into Simchas Torah. Does he need to eat it in the sukkah or he doesn't need to eat it in the sukkah? So Zot the Pri Megadim, Avada he has to eat it in the sukkah. And Shmini Atzeres, misofik, Yasuva Yasvinon, Bruch Eloim Bachinon, we sit in the sukkah. We're talking about Me'ikadina de Gemara. Me'ikadina de Gemara. The Minig Yisrael is many other minhagim up the Rishonim, but up Ikadina de Gemara. Zot the Ran, Tzarech L'meisa Basukkah. You have to sit in the sukkah. Fred the Pri Megadim, what's the difference? To shake lulav on Hoshana Rabbah is a drabonon. Lulav the rest of the Shiva Bagvulin is drabonon. To sit in the sukkah Shmini Atzeres toch Yom Tov Sheni is weiter drabonon. So what's the difference between the two? So obviously we can see here that there'll be nidonim of Yom Tov Sheni is a suffix. In the case of lulav, it's a suffix drabonon. The Ikka mitzvah here Shmini Atzeres is Otu Shvi, which is a deraisa. That's kama chilukim we can make in the sveikas. One of the chilukim that Rabbi Kiva Eger makes is he says, the end of the second paragraph, end of the Maskul Mihashta. He says, Ula yesh lidchois, ube'emes ma'hida sukkah ula yesh lidchois. D'le'inin achila chutz la sukkah have ke'ein iser, loy rak bittul mitzvah. That's stating Rabbi Kiva Eger. V'im kein have sveika b'deraisa. What's a sveika? Maybe Shmini Atzeres is really the seventh day of Sukkot, and maybe Bein Hashmoshes is still the Yom. So therefore, Zokter B'Kiva Eger, if Achila Chutz La Sukkah is an Isser, so then Zokter B'Kiva Eger, we have a sveika of can I be over an Isser of Achila Chutz La Sukkah. Zokter B'Kiva Eger, it's a Dover Shesh Lamatirim. Just wait till the Laila and you're for sure potter. So Zod Rabbi Kiva Eger, a sveika in Dover Sheyeshem Atirim of an Isser, wait till the Laila. That's Rabbi Kiva Eger. The sveika is it's correct. So we can I would want to be done in this, but let's just the time constraints. Let's just accept for the moment Rabbi Kiva Eger's cheshbon. But Hanagel in Yonenu is, as Rabbi Kiva Eger has said, that lulav is a kumba essay. If you're not loyal to lulav, what happens? Sachakoil. Chas v'shalom, not to be mezalzel. Bittul mitzvah. But to be oichel chutz la sukkah, Zod Rabbi Kiva Eger, habe kein issa loy rak bittul mitzvah. It's mamash seems to be so itself. Mamash mit kotza la kotza. Loime boy did be kvega tell us legabe oisik bamitzah potem and a mitzvah. That it's not just that it doesn't have a shem iser, it's not even considered bittul mitzvahs essay biyodayim. And here B'Kiveg is saying, "Pum forget it. Have a kain iser loirak bittul mitzvah." Advar masaysim mikatza la katza. So Be'ez Hashem B'Ktzara we'll see two more nafkiminas in Rabbi Seinu Achreinim. Benegea to the shaila of iser bittul essay, and we take that. We'll try and be oimed on being miyashiv the steer in Rabbi Kiveger and to give a hagdara for what the iser is. The Maramakim, which we'll discuss next, Be'ez Hashem, is a primigodim in Siman Tov Reish Mem in the Eshel Avram Sivkot and Yud, which in the pages of the Maramakim is on page 67, top of the page on the left hand side by the Eshel Avram. Three lines down, V'da. Zog the primigodim V'da. The oinen potem isukah mikol mitzvahs amuras patayra. Like an oinen is potter from all mitzvahs, he's potter from sukkah. How is the person going to be an oinen? On Yontav there's no aninus, so the primigodim is b'chol hamoyed. Oi misasik b'kvura idei akum b'yoyim rishon b'yontav sheni al yidei Yisrael, or he is involved in the kvura al yidei akum. So the primigodim has worked out a number of tzurim that there won't be aninus on sukkahs. V'yesh loymar is other primigodim maybe no. The dafka mitzvahs assay. And the only time an oinen is potter is in the mitzvahs essay, where we tell him that because you're being oisik in tzarchei hameis le'aleichem, sheva al ta'aseh. Go be oisik in the mace and don't be mekay in the mitzvahs essay. V'sukkah zot the primigodim ovar bekum ve'essay sha'oichel chutz la'sukkah. Zot the primigodim, no, here be your daim, you're eating chutz la'sukkah. That's not aninus. In other words, this is the svar of the shoyel. That like oisik b'mitzvah potem mitzvah the shoyel says is only from mavakel b'shev al ta'aseh krishma. So same thing. Aninus only says don't be mekay in the mitzvah, but doesn't say go bekum be'eseh and contribute a mitzvah. As I state in primigodim. Correct. We don't have as much as we'll see in the primigodim in a moment if he even has a tzad of esa. Then there's the primigodim makes a fascinating tushtel. If we'll have time, B'li we'll try to get back to the tushtel to the tur mitzvahs essay shazman grama by noshim. Does that allow the bekum ve'essay to contravene a mitzvahs essay shazman grama? We'll see the shayla. Well, perhaps if you have time, we'll come back to the shayla. So again, we have another nafkamina lemaisa. Oinen is an oinen potter from mitzvah sukkah. Primigodim zasofik. Let's continue with one further nafkamina. The primigodim on the same page, on Sivkotin Yudalid, lower down in the same Eshel Avram. Sivkotin, I apologize, there's a mistake in the Maramakimus. It says Sivkotin Yudalid, it should say Sivkotin Tesvav. I apologize. The primigodim, 3 lines into the primigodim, there's a period and then begins the word Misheba. So the primigodim declares the following shaila. Misheba baderech l'sukkos chaveroi beina akum. Someone's traveling and he comes to someone else's sukkah or he's beina akum. V'roitzim momen harbe b'shul sukkah. Now Rabbi say, if this seems a vaita tzir, the shaila came up halacha l'maisa not long ago. Last year, I think.
Really?
Someone was going on a trip and he came to a shtad and the only place he could get to sukkah was a hotel. And the hotel said, of course you can use the sukkah, but you have to book a room. This is a Yontif hotel, and it certainly wasn't bechinam. What does the Yid do? I'm mechuyev to go and pay. In the middle of Yontif, you want to book it. Yeah, it wasn't a kleinem atbeah. This is the primigodim shaila. What do you mechuyev to mevazvas to be able to for sukkah? So memele it says. So says the primigodim, we have a klal that the mitzvah iveres ain't tzarich lebazos is mom and rav. We pass in even a mitzvah iveres, you don't have to spend more than a chemish of your nechasim. You don't have to spend mom and rav. Not to be over a lois say chas v'shalom. You have to be mevazvos kol mamoinoi. The person would come to a place and he would need to eat. In order chas v'shalom not to eat macholos asuris, you have to be mevazvos kol mamoinoi. The yeshloima is at the primigodim. Maybe that's only that cap. that you only have to spend on a mitzvah esek kach v'kach is sheval taseh, where the alternative will be, I won't be mekayim the mitzvah. Over there in Tofresh involved, it means if I don't spend more than a chomesh ma'ayin, I won't have dalad minim chas v'shalom. Okay, sheval taseh, I'm not being late to lulav. I have a little meibad. Masha'inkin zot the primigodim besukkah kum va'asei oichel be'isur. Here we have a lashon of the primigodim ve'oichel be'isur. We have the Pnei Yeshua. K'moshe kosavti leil ayin Pnei Yeshua b'chidush of l'sukkah chafayim with aleph. He brings the Pnei Yeshua. So this Pnei Yeshua who said as a pshat in the Mishnah lomdas has a halacha nafkamina halacha l'maisa. Does that yid have to pay tiklin tovin in order to be able to have a hotel room that night? So you could use the sukkah. I'm sorry? He wasn't hoilech l'dvar mitzvah. He was on a trip. He's on a business trip. He's on a business trip. He's on a business trip. What? What?
Give me a quarter of Moshe.
Oh yeah. I just I'll be my dilemmas. I don't remember. I didn't look in my book to find all the pratim of the tshuva. I just remember the shaila. I don't remember why he wasn't potter. He didn't have the p'tur. It's possible because there was a sukkah lefonov, in which case Balayla we pass him that if there's a sukkah lefonov, he does have to be teriach to be eichel b'sukkah magen avram levush. So Mamela, he was Balayla in that city, and he had to be nichnas the sukkah. Now what's he mechuyev? So. Correct. So there's the Primi Godim, and he says, Teishvu kein taduru. What you would spend for what's the Primi Godim? What would you spend? The kol masha oisa badira yasa came besukkah. The dover muat mamen yitain. Now let's understand that for a moment. That's not so poshet, because what does it mean? What you would give for dira? What does that mean? What you would give for dira? It means what you would give for basically decent accommodations for a night.
For one day.
For a night, right? So what does that mean? How much is that? So true, maybe it's not a very exclusive hotel, but something. What if you were on a business trip?
Prorated share of your rent.
If you're on a business trip, what level of hotel do you pay? What accommodations do you pay for? This is the HaRav of the Pri Megadim, the Chiddush Pele, that the Chiyuv of Eitzah is nimdad kefi the Heitzos. As I state, nor the Pri Megadim. So we have another nafkamina of Isser or not. Frek the Pri Megadim, frek the Bikur Yaakov, Lemaisa, how could you say it has a Teras Isser? Lemaisa, Shluchim Mitzvah, P'turim and SUKKAH. In other words, what's the answer to the Pnei Yeshua's kasha? If you're going to say there's an Isser, what's the Yisay Advarim? So perhaps we could be matzia the following, and this would be a yishuv to Blinei the Rabbi Akiva Eiger's kasha, and this will be the point in which we'll conclude Blinei. We have a steer in Rabbi Akiva Eiger. On the one hand, Rabbi Akiva Eiger says there's no Isser, and it's even b'shev al taseh, the bittul. On the other hand, we have Rabbi Akiva Eiger that says that b'negeya to ben hashmoshes, it's a suffix Isser, and therefore we're machmir on ben hashmoshes and treat it as a davar sheshem matirim. A suffix is a davar sheshem matirim. Perhaps we could say the following: Avada b'mokum that there is a mitzvah to be oichel basukkah. If one isn't oichel basukkah, it's an Isser. But first, we have to decide if there is a mitzvah. So Zad Rabbi Akiva Eiger like this: if we want to decide, should there be a p'tur of oisik b'mitzvah patim and a mitzvah? That shaila is a shaila like any other bittul mitzvah says. Because the nidin is, are you mechuyev to go eat in the sukkah, or b'shav al taseh, am I going to be oichel chutz sukkah? But Zad Rabbi Akiva Eiger, once I establish that there is a mitzvah essay, then to be oichel chutz la sukkah, avada is an Isser. So Meir Rabbi Akiva Eiger says like this: to ask that oisik b'mitzvah potem and mitzvah should not apply by achila sukkah is a mistake. Mechilas koiteros shogag b'zeh. Because we have to first decide, is there a mitzvah to be oichel b'sukkah? And then we'll decide if, as a result of that, there therefore is an Isser. But the first question is, the basic question is, mechuyev or not mechuyev? Oisik b'mitzvah potem and mitzvah. But Zad Rabbi Akiva Eiger, if we are holding in ben hashmoshes and we have a suffix, is the person mechuyev to mekayim the mitzvah or not mechuyev to mekayim the mitzvah? And there's no way we can say potter, So if we have incorrectly patted him, then what we've allowed him to do is be over nessa. So the two different oifanim of Suffolk. If the nidin is the ptur of oisik b'mitzvah patam nitzah, avada the ptur applies to sukkah. Because the whole isser is only based on the prerequisite that there's an mitzvah of achila teichas sukkah, and that is pater from. Memela, that can never begin the possibility of discussing isser. Masha enkein Suffolk ben hashmashas possibly is, and just to say Maramakim, that there's a new edition of Rabbi Kiva Eger that was published by Rabbi Shlomo Arieli Shlita, the brother of Rosh Arieli. So in the new edition of that Rabbi Kiva Eger, on Daf Chofei Amud Aleph, he asks the stira, and as one of the Mahalchim, I found Be'ez Hashem that he suggests this Mahalach. That B'Yesoidoi, it's Choluk, whether or not we're discussing the P'tur from the mitzvah in the first place, and there Avada, the discussion is Chayav or Potter, and that's not to do with Isser. Masha Einkein, in the tzir of Suffolk, if he's mechuyev or not mechuyev to go be YESHIVAS SUKKAH, that Havada says Rabbi Kiva Eger, we can discuss as a Suffolk Isser. Just quickly to bring an analogy to this, very precise analogy. We discussed the shail of the Pri Megadim by Oinen. If Oinen is part from Achilas Sukkah, not the Pri Megadim, maybe it's an Isser. There is a machloikis between the Marshal and the Marshal in Perek Arvei Psochim. If achila without a bracha rishayna is an isser, or it's only that you're mechuyev to make a bracha b'kum be'esei. So zok the Shlomo Zalman in Minchas Shlomo. If there's an isser to eat without a bracha, then an oinein shouldn't be able to eat without a bracha rishayna. And the stimas hapoiskim is he can. Zok Rabbi Kiva Eger, avada there's an isser to be oichel without a bracha, but only when you mechuyev the bracha. Where Chazal will mechayiv you to make a bracha, then there's an issa to be oicha without a bracha. So by aninus, we first have to decide, is he mechuyev in mitzvahs? If he's potter from the bracha, there's no issa. As there's Rabbi Shlomo Zalman. Me'ein that svara is what Be'ez Hashem we're suggesting for. So lemaskonas hadvarim, what we're suggesting is in Rabbi Seinu Achroinim that the lashon asa lecho means where you are mechuyev to be oicha basukah. Then biyodayim being mevatel an essay, there is an isser to biyodayim be mevatel an essay. Ad kan the teichen advarim of the Pnei Yeshua and what's muchach from the steer in Rabbi Kiva Eger and l'cher what's muchach from Pri Megadim.
What's the link? What's the makor? By bracha, there's ne'ilah. There's some connection. What's the connection in Torah and some gezerah to make it an isser?
Not gezerah, it means we have a klal midiraisa that whenever there is a din that bekum be'eseh and mechuyev to do something, actively being mevatel an essay is also. It's not just a lost opportunity. It's a maisa which the Torah didn't allow to occur in that way. Like Rabbi Kiva Eger says, the mitzvah achila has to occur in the form of achila teichas sukkah, and therefore a mitzvah achila in contravention to the form in which the Torah mandated it to be done is issa.
Is there a link in the bar or something like this?
This is a concept. Yes, this is a concept. It's a concept. It's a concept. Yeah.
Let's Rav wants to finish.
Divrei Agada. Yeah. So just mention briefly Divrei Agada. You know, often the ma'oros of that are occurring among the Ummah Ha'olam are supposed to be a limud for Klal Yisrael. We have to the tzad of Puranus, the Gemara which says, "Ein Puranus ba la'olam ela b'shvil Yisrael." But, and perhaps this isn't as relevant to you as it is to someone who has more of a connection to England than perhaps you do. But we're also being oisik in what the Gemara in Bracha says is la'olam yarutz adom likras malchei Ummah Ha'olam. It's a period of coronation now in England. Those of you who are some way associated with that, maybe it means more to others than to but it's the Chazal related to this. And Chazal says, La'olam yorutz odom likras malchei Yisrael. Shem yirtze yavchin ben malchei Ummah Ha'olam l'malchei Yisrael. Yirtze. Miyizke yavchin ben malchei Ummah Ha'olam l'malchei Yisrael. And it's haloidoverhu that in the yomim in which Klal Yisrael is making itself, Kabbalas Malchusa Yisbarach, for Tamlichuni Aleichem, we have a sense of the difference between Malchei Ummah Ha'olam and Malchei Yisrael. On Yud Tes El, it's brought in Seder Adoros, Yud Tes El, at the coronation of Richard, of King Richard, for those who are familiar with English history, it was Nekad al Kiddush Hashem, the Rime or Leinish, the Talmud of Rabbeinu Tam, as part of the celebration of the Haftarah. It's brought in Seder Adairs. It's a great tragedy of the Rimi Olainish, the Balataisis, Talmud Rabbeinu Tam. It was on the Yom of the Hachtara, which is Yud Tes Elul, for the Seder Adairs. Today, this Maisa happened. What's the Yesod of the Chiluk? The Yesod of the Chiluk is that Malchei Yisrael, their entire Malchus, the basis of their Malchus is because it's a reflection of Malchus Yisbarach. Ein memanim melech ela al pi Sanhedrin v'novi. Why? Why is it ein memanim melech al pi Sanhedrin v'novi? Because the matara of the melech is a vehicle for Gili Kavod Shamayim. Malchusa da'aro ke'ei Malchusa de'rikia. Malchus Yisrael is supposed to give us a sense, and is supposed to be the embodiment kiviyachol of Malchusa Yisbarach. And Memele, all the Dinei HaMalchus are all in order to be able to that the Melech should be the embodiment of Malchus Shamayim. The reason why it's Mavur in Radvaz and Tami HaMitzvos that Melech Shemochel al Kvoidei Ein Kvoidei Mochel is because his covered is the covered of the Rebbeinu Shlomo. He's an embodiment of Malchus Shamayim. Our hasaga, our tfisa, the reason why there's a mitzvah of soin tosim alecha melech is because alidei that we margish a me'ein of Malchus Adirikia. Masha'enken in the Malchus of Umas Ha'olam is having mispal b'shloima shal Malchus because Ilav came. Ishas re'yu chayim b'loi. There's a concept that Malchei Umas Ha'olam are necessary for Yeshuvah shal Olam. And Lui Tzuya, the Melech is goizer, something which is not b'mishpat. There's no din even of din of the Malchus Adina because it's chamsenusa v'loi din. The Lo'ilam Yavchin is because Malchus Yisrael is me'ein a gilui of Malchus Shamayim. That's the chiluk. And Memele, the hisboinenus in Malchus, in the concept of Malchus in Klal Yisrael, is there to give us a sense of what L'sakin Oilam b'Malchus Shakai will be. But the same way as there's a Melech, where the Melech Yisrael will be all the more a gilui of kavod, of pageantry, of majesty, of stature, will be kifli kiflayim in Malchus Yisrael. That's a me'ein de me'ein of Malchus Adirikia, which will be nizgale in L'sakin Oilam b'Malchus Shakai. It's a me'ein de me'ein. The Gra in Klole HaGra is Magdir, that the Iker Gilu of Malchus Shamayim is in the entire Bria being Meshubad to and being Mekayim Ritzoni Yisbarach. That's the Iker Kovad Malchus that there is. Melech b'mishpat Ya'amid Eretz. The Iker Kovad of a Melech is being Maimid Mishpat. The entire concept of Kovad Malchus is to create Moira in the to allow that Dvar Melech should be Dvar Melech Shiltei. Zog they're going, the Iker Gili of Malchus Shaka that we'll be mistaken for is not so much a chitzoniistic Gilui, so to speak, of Ginuni Malchus, of Shchinosa Yisbarach. But the Iker Nekuda is that a Brio which is entirely in sync and is Kol Kuloi dedicated to Gilim, to Kiyum Ritzoni Yisbarach, is a Malchus of Gilui Kvoidei. The Goin says that the Kavanah that we say in Krishma, Baruch, Shem Kvoid Malchusai La'ilam Vaid. What does it mean, the Gilui of Shem Kvoid Malchusai? Baruch Kvoid Malchusai, or Baruch Shmoi. The combination of Shem Kvoid Malchusai means that the Iker Gilui of Kvoid Malchusai is Gilui Shmoi. The Zman in which it will be Bayoimahu Yeh Havaya Echad Ushmoi Echad. Like Rashi says in the end of Parashat B'Shalach, Ad Achshov, Ein Hashem Sholem ve'ein HaKisei Sholem. The Ein Hashem Sholem means is that there's a limit that limits the Gilui of the Anhag of the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Rebbeinu Shalom remains a Kel Mistater. Gilui of Shem Koed Malchusa means it will be Mizgala that everything in the Brio is all Soive v'hoylech, that they're going around Hanhagasa Yisbarach. That Gilui is the Gilui of the Mitzapeh of Koed Malchus. What we take out of the covered of Malchei Umas Olam Shem Yizka Lahavchem is that kvoid of covered Melech Yisrael is to be Megalik kvoid Shomayim, and the Iker Gili of covered Shomayim is Melech b'Mishpat Yamid Aretz. That the entire brio will be Yatu Shechem Echad Lo Avdecha, and the entire brio will be a brio which will bespeak that bittul to Ritzonei Yisbarach. But le'is'ato, we remain with the emptiness of Malchus Umas Ha'olam, or on the Yom of the Hachtara of one of the Havdil, the greatest kings in English history, was the Yom in which it was Nekad al Kiddush Hashem, the Rima Alayim Shtamid Rabbeinu. That's what we were soivel from the Malchus of Umas Ha'olam. Shem Yizke, Be'ez Hashem will be mavchin to that Yom HaGadol of the Sakin Olam of Malchus Shaka.
If I remember correctly, Richard is one of the greatest Rishonim